Hi class, this is the video lecture for the key for the practice test for compounds. And so we'll start with number 1. When a reaction occurs between atoms with the ground state electron configurations 2, 1 and 2, 7, what I will do is I will pull up the periodic table here. 2, 1 means 3 electrons, and 2, 7 is a total of 9 electrons, which if we look up those atomic numbers, we're looking at lithium and fluorine. In our case, we have a metal and a nonmetal, which gives us the answer of ionic. Move this out of the way. So, when ionic bonds are formed, metallic atoms, what they do lose electrons and become positive. That is just knowledge of how metals behave. And if you ever forget, remember, metals lie here, and they typically form +1, +2 charges. Which statement best describes the substance that will result when electrons are transferred from a metal to a nonmetal? Again, talking about what type of bond this is, you should know it's ionic, so it can't be C or D. And you should remember a property of ionic bonds is a high melting point. A substance that does not conduct electricity as a solid, but does when it is melted. So in our case, again, ionic compound. And in our, what we have to recall here is that ionic compounds do not conduct electricity until their ions are free to move and pass that charge along. Which element compound contains only 2 elements? Here's recognizing polyatomic ions. Hydroxide is OH, sulfate is SO4, and ammonium is NH4. So in our case, the only one is aluminum oxide, which that is technically this, but anywho, which is the formula for magnesium sulfide? Our case, this is sulfite, this is manganese sulfite, so manganese sulfide. Which compound is in the ratio of metal ions to non-metal ions 1 to 2? So 1 metal to 2 nonmetals. So if we were to grab this periodic table here, if we look at calcium, right here, calcium forms a +2 charge. Bromide likes to form -1 charge. So if we need the charges to cancel out, how they would combine is calcium 1, Br2, in our case, metal, nonmetal, are 1 to 2 ratio. So that's why it's A. What is the chemical formula of iron 3 sulfide? Well, iron 3, that 3 denotes the charge, so we know we're working with a +3. Sulfide is, I'll switch color here, in red, is in the -2 column. And don't forget that you can put the charges from 1 is the number of atoms for the opposite. So don't forget that little trick there. So we get iron 2, sulfide 3, or B. So the correct formula for aluminum sulfate, now sulfate, you have to recognize that's a polyatomic ion. And from table E, you get SO4. SO4 is a 2- charge. Aluminum is +3. Again, with that rule of the opposite ion gets the number of atoms is the charge. So Al is 2, sulfate is 3. Which formula represents a substance that contains covalent bonds? So not ionic, meaning which is not a metal and a nonmetal, but in our case we want 2 nonmetals, and the only option here is D. Which atoms are most likely to form covalent bonds? Again, we don't want metals, but in our case, for bonding, do we share protons or electrons? Well, not protons, so it has to be C. Which formula represents a molecular compound? We have to remember the terminology here. Molecular this means covalent. So again, we're looking for two nonmetals. Hydrogen is a nonmetal, even though it's found on the left side of the periodic table, so the answer is Hi. An unknown substance, liquid X, is tested in the laboratory. The chemical and physical test results are below. It's a non-conductor, which means it's not ionic. Insoluble in water, which is a polar solvent, meaning you have to remember like dissolves like. And what I mean by that is polar things will dissolve in polar solvents. Non-polar compounds dissolve in non-polar solvents. So if something is not soluble in water, that means it has to be a non-polar. And then it continues and says it is soluble in a non-polar. Again, reassuring that we have a non-polar substance. So for sure non-polar, a non-conductor tells us it's covalent. So we have a non-polar covalent compound. What is formed when two atoms of bromine bond together? So we have to think about bromines has 7 valence electrons. So in our case, what is formed? Well, monoatomic means one atom. Well, it says we need 2. Heterogeneous and homogeneous mixtures, we're not even talking about those this chapter. So it's a diatomic molecule. Which is the correct electron dot formula for a hydrogen molecule at STP? Hydrogen is also diatomic, so what you're going to get is D here. They each contribute an electron to each other. A correct name for N2O3? Well, you have to remember the prefixes for molecular compounds, which is di for 2, nitrogen, tri for 3, oxide. So remember, we still use the regular name of the anion, the cation, but for the anion, we have to still use "ide" at the end. So C is your answer here. The degree of polarity of a chemical bond in a molecule of a compound can be predicted by determining the difference in the, so right now we're looking at polarity for bonds. No, you can't determine for melting point, no densities, no atomic masses, but C, electronegativities of the bonded atoms is the right answer.